At this point, it has been approximately 150 years that the rights of man and these other wonderful, huge philosophical issues have been debated in the salons of Paris and the sitting rooms in England and throughout all of Europe. It is only to be expected then that after some amount of time that there was going to be a result of all these conversations, especially when you consider the fact that the aristocracy basically ignored them. The kings and queens of Europe, especially of France, were basically doing what they'd always done, living extravagantly, having these wonderful, plush, rich lives, even though at the same time their people were starving. And the philosophes especially were getting so frustrated with the fact that they had all these wonderful ideas and basically could not enact any of them because the aristocracy wouldn't go along. So what's going to happen? Revolution. That's what's going to happen. And the first place it happens is here in America. Now, basically, all those wonderful Enlightenment ideals we've been talking about, basically, we're finding a very ready audience in America, too. Our forefathers, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, all of those guys were reading Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Voltaire. Now, keep in mind, they were all still alive, more or less. So many of them even actually met them, had conversations with them directly about their ideas, and were just as excited about what these guys had to say as their European counterparts. And the same conversations in the same salons were happening here in America, even though, of course, it wasn't quite as sophisticated and elegant because America was not France at this time. But all the way back in 1743, Benjamin Franklin started the American Philosophical Society. I mean, there was a pattern here where the Americans were basically having the same conversations as their European counterparts. Now, everything started coming to a head in America with what the Brits called the 7 Years' War, what here in America we call the French and Indian War. And the name that we call it here in America is a bit misleading because the French and the Indians were both the enemies. They were both on one side against the British. And of course, since America was still a British colony, we were with the British. And this long war took place. It was taking place worldwide, actually. In some ways, you could consider this the First World War. But the skirmishes that happened here were largely going to give rise to a man that's going to become very important to us, who, of course, is George Washington. He was a rising soldier in this time and had lots of experience and became quite renowned in America based on his leadership in this war. Now, after the war ended, though, is what we really care about. We don't care about, the actual fights themselves. Britain argued that they were fighting this war because they were defending the colonies, okay? And if they were defending the colonies, then it's only fair that the colonies help pay for it, which in some ways is a very reasonable idea, right? That they, the Brits had to, spent a lot of money sending soldiers and supplies here to protect the colonies from the French. And while in theory, the actual taxes that Britain was passing to try to basically do this cost share were extremely low, the problem that the Americans had with it is that nobody asked them. Okay, first of all, nobody asked them to be if they wanted to be defended or not. And secondly, nobody asked them if they'd be willing to share the cost. All they wanted, basically, was they wanted one representative in Parliament that could sit there and could very easily be outvoted by the rest of Parliament, but just so that they actually could have possibly had a say in either voting for or against the taxes that they were now being forced to pay. And of course, that's where that really famous line comes from: no taxation without representation. But we all know the story. The Brits absolutely refused. There was the king was still in charge. He has absolute control. If he says that America is going to pay taxes, America is going to pay taxes. And there was no way he was going to give in to their claims that they deserved a spot in Parliament. He just totally didn't want to go there. And so he refused to cooperate, which of course is what ultimately led to the war. The actual fighting of the war, again, not something we really care about. It's fascinating in and of itself, but it's not really our interest right now. What we care about is how the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and all those ideals that came out were directly a result of those Enlightenment thoughts. Okay. Now, the Declaration of Independence, first of all, of course, as you know, written by Jefferson, extremely influenced by Locke and Rousseau. In fact, Locke had written, extensively about, liberalism and how, man doesn't have to give up too much of his freedom to the government and so forth. You remember the conversations that Locke had, and especially how he basically argued against what Hobbes had to say. Well, Jefferson was extremely in line with Locke. Every time he read Locke, he totally agreed. And when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, he actually almost plagiarized the man with just a few minor changes. One thing he changed is, first of all, we don't want a king. All right. Jefferson was not a monarchist the way Locke was. Locke, being an Englishman, thought that it was perfectly fine to have a king as long as it was balanced by a parliament, to actually have the voice of the people heard as well. Jefferson got rid of that. We just wanted our parliament, quote unquote, which became a Congress, of course. However, Locke is very famous for saying all men have the right to pursue life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. He was a little bit less focused on kind of the materialistic financial side than Locke was. Whereas you have to remember, for Locke, the pursuit of property was a major thing because in England, only the aristocrats could own property. But nonetheless, what the Declaration of Independence is all about. I want you to realize just how much it was the European philosophers that actually shaped it. Now, at the same time that the actual revolution itself was happening, another major revolution was happening, but this time in the art world. We've been talking about the Rococo and kind of just how flamboyant and over the top and really an extension, so to speak, of the Baroque continued in the aristocratic circles. Well, the philosophers and everyone else in the real world is looking at that and just being like, that's crazy. Why should we be celebrating, pleasure and debauchery and kind of all this amoral that the aristocrats are involved in? Instead, we should have an art that reflects our ideals, our reason, our control, our focus on rights and logic and all those things. And that is why neoclassicism was born. Now, neoclassicism, like the name suggests, is new classicism. And classicism is ancient Greece and Rome. Okay? So close your eyes and imagine a Greek temple. Those columns, the little triangle on top, all the beautiful statues, all that stuff. That is what the neoclassicists focused on, okay? And so harmony, balance, and proportion all came back into vogue. We don't want passion. We don't want sexuality. We don't want, that excess that is really killing the aristocracy at this point. What we want is control, and those became kind of the founding ideals of these revolutionary movements. Now, as a result of that, the way buildings were built were very much throwbacks to the ancient world, all right? And they really were doing this for a couple of reasons. Like I said, for one thing, it just kind of fit more with Enlightenment thinking. I mean, if you're talking about reason and logic and control, it kind of doesn't go with sensuality and passion. But also, it had kind of a bigger symbolic effect as well. For one thing, the Greeks had given birth to the concept of democracy. So since these revolutions were being fought in favor of democracy, let's get rid of these absolute monarchs trying to tell us what to do all the time. It would only kind of made sense to have references to the original Greeks who had discovered the term itself. And also, it kind of lent an air of stability to it. Keep in mind, when the American Revolution was going on, nobody knew if it was going to last a day, a week, a month, or a year. It was totally, this brand new experiment. So by building their buildings in such a way to kind of reflect 2,000 years of history, it kind of lent the idea that we were going to make it. We could survive this. And of course, when Washington, D.C. gets built in the early 1800s, I mean, look at the Capitol. You can't miss all the classical elements that are in here. This is a beautiful example of neoclassicism. You know, all those lovely little columns everywhere, tons of geometry, everything's very parallel and symmetric. And of course, the beautiful dome on top, which is actually a Roman element, and the statues. You know, like we have statues on top, we have the little, you know, the friezes on top of the little triangle pediment over the main doors. I mean, every part of this just screams neoclassicism. And when you look at the fact that they were trying to basically model this as like just like the Greeks lasted for, you know, centuries, so too will our new America. Another really famous example of neoclassicism in America is the building in front of you, which is Monticello. This was actually Jefferson's home in Virginia, and he was just a brilliant man. I mean, he was a writer, he was an architect, he designed this all himself, as well as presidents and everything else. And when you look at it again, the columns, the little triangle pediment over the main door, all the geometry where everything is parallel and very picturesque. And he even went so far as to include like garden elements around it to like really reflect like harmony and attachment, so to speak, to nature, that were all integrated in some way. Portraiture, not surprisingly, changed a ton too. I know you remember the swing when we were talking about Rococo and some of the other like kind of just really over the top pieces where literally the aristocrats were trying to show off more than anything else. Well, neoclassicist portraiture was very different. As you can see, for one thing, the main guy, by the way, was an artist named Copley. He was the main guy here in America, and he was putting out portraits of the American revolutionaries that were meant to convey something very different. Now, first of all, the man you see before you, quite famous for riding through the streets of Boston yelling, "The British are coming." That's, of course, Paul Revere. As you can see, he's in a very pensive mood, right? So he reflecting the ideas of reason and logic. As you can see, he's very simply dressed. We're not wearing all that frou-frou crap that the Brits and the Brits and the French and everyone else was wearing. We're simple. We're down to earth. We're practical. And in fact, it almost looks like he's sitting in like a workroom. As you can see, the background, there's no beautiful like gardens and swings and everything else in the background for him. He is much more serious than that. That's what neoclassicism was all about. Another piece by Copley here shows a woman. Now, of course, the women are going to be a little bit more fancily dressed just because that's how women dress, but still nothing compared to the huge excess that we saw in Rococo pieces. But otherwise, very contemplative, very simplistic, not outside, you know, enjoying the pleasures. Like you have the idea that she's about to sit down and write a term paper or something. It's very serious work. Now, the revolution in America lasted for a couple of years and, as you know, was ultimately successful. And what's going to happen is that this is going to have huge, far-reaching effects in Europe, especially France. And it's actually the French Revolution where we want to spend the majority of our time this week, because arguably there is no event that has more significance in the modern world than what happened in France in 1789. Now, the ideals in America, you know, that neoclassicism, the columns and everything else, were absolutely spreading into Europe as well. And Paris became the absolute center of the neoclassical movement. And just like in America, it embodied the Enlightenment ideals. The people liked it. They felt like it finally matched in a way that Rococo just never did. But the big difference between neoclassicism in America and in Europe was that the Europeans became extremely antagonistic against the monarchy and against Christianity. They looked at both the church and the king as the symbols of oppression that have just for centuries been holding the people down, they argued, and milking them dry and leaving them to starve and just everything else. And so when they started building their neoclassical items and their neoclassical paintings, they wanted to eliminate it And this, of course, becomes an extremely powerful political message that is not going to be ignored by the aristocracy. One of the most famous buildings that was built in this era is known as the Pantheon. And when you look at that, what's kind of interesting is that when this was originally built, it was a church. Okay. And when you look at that, you're like, whoa, that totally doesn't look like a church that's been built since the ancient Greek times. And there you go. That's quite intentional. They are intentionally throwing back. We have those beautiful columns. We have the triangular pediment on top. We have the dome. We have all this symmetry. Like literally, it's a church. Now, it didn't last long as a church. It was basically taken over very quickly by the revolutionaries. And my favorite part of the Pantheon now is that this is actually where Rousseau and Voltaire get to stare at each other for all eternity, because it's been basically turned into not a museum exactly, but a place where people who are interested in history and the revolution specifically can go visit the tombs of famous people. And so even though Voltaire and Rousseau hated each other so much, they get to spend their entire after death experiences like looking at each other side by side in the Pantheon. Now, this is an interior shot of the Pantheon. And again, hard to believe it was a church, right? It just doesn't look like a church. But it does look very much like a Greek temple, with the columns, the geometry, the beautiful parallelism everywhere else. So we're getting the same sorts of buildings coming into existence here as we saw in America. That's not shocking. Neoclassical painting in Europe is a little different though. Okay, in America we talked about Copley, we talked about like the portraiture. That's basically what was happening. There wasn't a lot of other really important painting happening. That is not the case in France, specifically Paris. And the guy who became the voice of the neoclassical painting movement was a guy named David. It looks like David, but of course we can't pronounce it David. David. Okay. Now David had all kinds of issues, and you're going to get to know him quite well in the coming weeks. But he had an injury on his face that he incurred actually in a duel with someone. He got cut like right along his cheek, and it never really healed the way it was supposed to. And so he literally couldn't talk. I mean, he could mumble, but it was very hard for people to understand him and so forth. So he kind of poured all of his expressionism into his painting, because of course he could tell you what he wanted you to know without having to actually speak the words. And that of course becomes very important, because David really has a lot that he wants to tell us. Now, this particular piece became really important in the period. It's known as the death of Socrates. And Socrates, if you remember, was the Greek philosopher who basically went around talking about, the way things should be and the rights of people and so forth in ancient Greece. And as a result of all of his ideas, again, those same sorts of ideas that were kind of being touted in Europe and in America at this point, he was sentenced to death. He was actually forced to commit suicide. And as you can see, the man in red is handing Socrates a cup. That is it's a cup of poison known as hemlock. And revolutionaries, especially David, looked at this as exactly what was going to happen to them. All these wonderful philosophers with all these wonderful ideas and trying to change the world for the better in their minds, they thought that the government was going to come crashing down on them sooner or later. And they could be like Socrates, this great, brilliant guy who's forced to kill himself because the government doesn't like him, or they can do something about it. And obviously, as you can see from the way David presented this painting, he wants people to do something about it. Don't sit around and cry. Don't pretend that, oh, woe is me, there's nothing I can do. Because you know what? There's a lot fewer of aristocrats and nobilities running around than there are of us. We can do something. But political message aside, when you actually look at this, I want to point out a few elements of what makes this neoclassical. For one thing, again, the geometry. Look at that lovely archway, at the little hallway going down into the back. Okay, the very stark background. Okay, we're done with Rococo's focus on pretty, beautiful flowers and everything else. We are stark. We are real. We are, focused. balanced. All these guys basically kind of lined up, where Socrates is there and everyone is on one side or the other, extremely balanced. And the use of color. There's like one or two flashes of color, but for the most part, it's a much more somber image. That is neoclassicism to a T. This is another really famous piece by David. This is known as the Oath of the Harati. And essentially what the deal is this. Again, if you look at it, you can tell just by looking, this is not a contemporary scene. This is ancient, all right? So just like, David went back to ancient Greece for his portrait of Socrates, we see him going back to the ancients again for this particular piece. And the deal basically was this, what the setting is. Two nations were about to clash in the ancient world, and they actually came up with a deal to try to spare some lives. Instead of having, thousands and thousands of people killing each other on battlefields and basically decimating both nations, they said, look, let's do this. We'll pick our 3 best guys. You pick your 3 best guys. They'll go at it. Last one standing wins. Okay. And the three champions, so to speak, on the Roman side were the gentlemen on the left, and they just happened to be 3 brothers. Okay. They were the best fighters in their area. And so they are basically swearing on their swords to their father, that's their father in the middle, that they will fight to the death, and that they are not going to let the fact that they love each other and everything else stop them from basically doing what they have to do to save the country. So the center and left side is extremely heroic and focused on, fighting and courage and everything else. The right, of course, the other half of this parallel structure is the women. Okay, these are their wives. Basically that because they know. Best case scenario, one of them is going to get their husband back. Worst case scenario, they're all widows by the time this is over. But to add even further to it is that the sister, one of the sisters of these men, is married to a champion on the other side. Okay, so that particular woman has nothing to look forward to. She is either going to lose her brother or she's going to lose her husband. There's no good outcome for her. But what I want you to notice, and again what David was trying to convey here, is that fighting for what's right, which is the ideals of your country and everything else, for freedom, for liberty, for safety, are more important than personal sacrifice. Okay, even though these women are suffering and they're going to be, they're going to be hurt. There's nothing to it. They're going to be hurt. None of them are trying to dissuade their husbands. None of them are trying to talk them out of it. They just are accepting their fate as calmly as they can. And if you notice, the men are kind of not even paying any attention. Sometimes we must sacrifice, is what David is trying to tell us. And this painting caused an uproar when it came out. The aristocracy hated it. The people loved it because they thought that basically this is what we ultimately are going to have to be doing. Now, again, politics aside, let's look at the neoclassical elements. Again, we see the beautiful, the beautiful arches in the background, so lots of geometry there, a really stark, somber background, not a lot of colors, an interior scene, a few splashes of red, but otherwise very somber colors, and extremely parallel. The father in the middle, with 3 figures on either side. Last little one I just want to kind of preview. This is a famous gentleman by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. He is going to become important coming soon. I don't want to spend too much time on him right now. But this is another one of David's paintings of him. And this is actually extremely classical in orientation because, again, focus on one man, wearing the almost like a toga coming down, the horse rearing, which would have been a sign of strength and everything else. And of course, even though we are outside, look at how somber the background is on the mountains and everything else. Now, the other thing, the other story element of this is that if you notice in the bottom left, it's got Bonaparte written there, which is Napoleon's last name. So that's, him. Underneath there, cut off just a little bit, is the word Hannibal. Hannibal was an ancient general who basically crossed the Alps with an army of elephants. It's a really cool story, just not appropriate for us right now, but look it up. What David is doing is he is equating Napoleon to this ancient general. He is saying our leaders today are just as awesome as the leaders of the ancient world, and we should trust them. When people like Napoleon are going to lead us into battle, we are going to win. And basically, David almost became like a propagandist for Napoleon in times to come. And again, we'll talk more about Napoleon as we continue. Now, let's talk a little bit about the revolution itself. Artists were revolting against Baroque and Rococo. We already seen that. We have seen this drastic shift to neoclassicism. That totally mirrors what's about to happen politically and militarily. Okay, the philosophes have been on their soapboxes now for 150 years. People are listening, and they start getting just so fed up with King Louis the 16th, with the church, with the poverty, with all this stuff. And then when the revolution in America happens, that is basically the spark that the French need to actually go forward themselves. They say, look, America did it. They fought those dirty British kings, and they were able to get their independence. And if America can do it, there's no reason we can't. Let's do it ourselves. And so it all begins with the storming of a prison. Basically, there was a prison in Paris known as the Bastille that it was like this huge medieval dark, dungeon, basically, that became really symbolic of basically the monarchy's control over the people. And the average people with the soldiers at their side, like literally it took like 2 minutes before the soldiers abandoned the king and joined the masses, stormed this castle. They stormed it. They freed all the prisoners inside. There were only 7, but that's okay. They stormed them. They took control of the guns, everything else, and they said, this is it. We are no longer going to be just minions of our king. We want control of our government ourselves. And when you look at why it happened, it kind of makes sense. All right, the French had basically been involved with one war or another with England for more than 100 years. Right? Think about how exhausting it is here in America. We've only been at war for a decade. Think about multiplying that by 10, just how exhausted people would have been and how desirous they would have been for peace. But not only are we just talking about the mental aspect of it, think about the cost. The French have been sending their sons and fathers and husbands to the front to die, for 100 years. They've, of course, been having to pay the soldiers and everything else, as well as feed them, clothe them, everything else. So there was this huge national debt associated with these wars as well. Top it off by the fact that the king and the people that he had actually running, like the finances, were pretty stupid. They were making bad decisions, bad investments, everything else. And I think probably the biggest irony of all is that the King of France had sunk an awful lot of money into America supporting the colonists. Now, in some ways, and the way Louis thought of it, he's like, I'm just getting that dirty English king, because the king of England and the king of France had been long traditional enemies. But you gotta kind of wonder at the irony here, that literally the king of France is supporting colonists who are trying to throw off control by a king. Talk about a bad precedent, right? But Louis did not think that. He didn't pay attention to it. But the problem was that he had invested so much money in the American colonies that he had to raise taxes very, very high in his own country to avoid bankruptcy. And that attitude, that mentality, just pushed people over the edge. They're like, we are not going to continue paying all these ridiculous taxes to support you and your luxurious lifestyle when people are starving in the streets every single day. Now, what ended up happening is that the nation was on the brink of this huge catastrophe, and people knew it. And so for the first time in a very long time, the king summoned the Estates General. And basically, this was kind of like Congress. It was Congress that hadn't met in a really, really long time. because Louis didn't need them, and he certainly didn't want to be told what to do. But the people were so distraught and upset, and he could sense, that there was something happening, that he basically felt like he had no choice. He had to, call them. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Estates General is traditionally divided into three houses, if you will. They called them estates. But just like here in America, we have the Senate and then we have the House of Representatives. Well, it's kind of the same deal with the Estates General, except for they were tripartite. They were three parts, okay? The first estate was all the churchmen. Okay, so all the priests and all that, they would all get together and they would decide what they wanted to do. The second estate were all the nobles, and of course the king, was a part of the second estate. So they would get together and decide what they wanted to do. And the third estate was everybody else. Now, each of these little groups had one vote. Okay, so a question would come up before them. The clergy would have one vote, the nobility would have one vote, everybody else would have one vote. And of course, what's going to happen is that the clergy and the nobility always teamed up against everyone else. And you can see kind of that lovely little caricature on the right there of the noble and the clergyman kind of dancing on top of the normal guy, because it's what you going to do? We're always going to outvote you. The problem was the clergy and the nobility only represented about 3% of the population. Everybody else was in that third estate, and everybody else was getting outvoted. Now, that's about to change, because people are listening to what the philosophes had to say, and they're like, that's ridiculous. Why should 3% of the population dictate to 97% of the population? That's just not the way it's supposed to be. And that is not what we signed up for when we agreed to have a king. Now, just kind of a little interesting FYI, sometimes you'll hear the term fourth estate mentioned. Fourth estate did not exist in real life, okay? It was never a part of the Estates General, but the fourth estate is considered to be newspapers, like the media and stuff like that. And of course, the newspaper coverage of this period was very sympathetic to the third estate. And so, a lot of people who think they're really clever call them the fourth estate because they were so influential and everything else, but they did not have a vote. They did not have a say. It was just literally a way to kind of rile people up and get them really excited. And you still, even to this day, hear people call modern media and stuff like that the fourth estate. So just kind of a cool, interesting thing. Now, what you see before you here is a David piece. It's obviously unfinished. As you can see, he did an immense job, sketching it out, but he never actually was able to return to it and finish painting it. But what happens at this Estate General's meeting is that the nobility and the aristocracy and the clergy just try to do what they've always done. Say, everybody else, you just shut up, you do what we say, and we're going to kind of keep things going the way we like it. And the Estates General basically split at this point, because the third estate said, screw that. I don't think so. We are not going to just sit by and let you keep dictating to us. And so what you see before you is the third estate, all the representatives from the rest of France. They pulled out of the Estates General. They said, you are not the real government of France. You do not represent the people. We are not even playing ball with you anymore. They actually went to the tennis court. This is actually the tennis court at Versailles. And they basically locked themselves in the room and they vowed to each other, we are not going to leave until we have a constitution, until we have something that actually represents the rights of the average Frenchman. And this was more or less an act of treason. Okay, they basically were saying, you are not going to be in charge anymore, King Louis. We're doing it ourselves. And they all swore. And every single one of those men who swore knew that they were risking their lives. But this was kind of the flame that started it all, because between the storming of the Bastille in Paris, where the king's soldiers themselves revolted, and now the people themselves coming out and saying, oh, we're taking charge, things were going downhill really fast for Louis. Now, the problem is, it got crazy really, really fast. The three buzzwords that came to be associated with the French Revolution were liberté, égalité, and fraternité. That just means liberty, equality, fraternity, brotherhood. All right. And again, in theory, all three of those things are absolutely marvelous concepts, and something that, pretty much any rational person would totally agree with. Of course, we're free. Of course, we should be equal. And of course, we should be like brothers to each other. We should take care of each other. The problem is, people were hungry for revenge. All right. As they looked at kind of just how disparate the lives of the rich and the lives of the poor had become, they were angry basically about it. And a guy named Robespierre took over. And I love the name of it. He was actually the head of something known as the Committee on Public Safety. And his idea is, there are an awful lot of enemies out there. There are an awful lot of people who still support the king. Maybe they're just not brave enough to say it. There's an awful lot of people there that would, change things back to the way they used to be. And once the king was formally removed as head of state, he was imprisoned. But there was always this constant fear that somebody was going to spring him. Somebody was going to get him out. We were going to have this horrible war, the civil war. We don't want that. And so Robespierre did what he felt was logical and appropriate. He started killing people. All right. And the Reign of Terror came into existence. Now, obviously, anything called Reign of Terror must have been pretty horrible. All right. And in fact, when you look at some of the images of this period, you're going to see what I mean. Here's what we have. We have people carrying around heads on stakes. We have the guillotine invented. The guillotine is what the French would say. And what's kind of ironic about the guillotine was that when it was invented by a doctor. His name was Dr. Guillotine. And he was trying to come up with a humane, quick way to execute public criminals. Okay. So up until now, people, were either shot, but, a lot of times you didn't die from the shot itself. You died from infection caused by the shot, or people could be hanged, but literally you didn't always die immediately when you would hang. Just as common as somebody hanging and breaking their neck and dying instantaneously was somebody hanging, not breaking their neck, and basically starving to death, like hanging alive, for days. Now, Dr. Guillotine looked at that and said, that's not humane. We want to find a good way of killing somebody quickly that's going to be painless. And so he invented the guillotine, which is, of course, that really sharp blade that they would drop down and behead people with. Sadly, we did not know this at the time. But what we now know is that even when a person's head is cut off, that head actually remains sentient for like 30 seconds. All right. And this wasn't like it was the most pristine of death scenes. Like literally, as that bottom left-hand picture kind of shows you, it became like a picnic. People would bring lunches to the guillotine in the middle of the town center. They would all reel up and they would literally have like a drum beat when they would get ready to drop the blade, and everyone would cheer and they would pick up the head and they would kind of show it to the masses. And as you can see in the top left picture, like the blood would still be dripping from the head and so forth. What we now know, like I said, is that head was actually still sentient for like 30 seconds, that the brain didn't die immediately. And so literally, like, the person with their head being held up would be hearing the screams of the people that were cheering for their deaths. They could see what was happening. Hopefully they couldn't feel anything. That would be a terrible thing, but perhaps they did. Who knows? But what happened is that the French became absolutely bloodthirsty, and that anybody and everybody who did not publicly just like cheer for, the revolution was executed. And by the end of a year, now keep in mind, the total reign of terror lasted about 18 months altogether. Okay. So this is not the French went crazy one day and just executed a few people. I mean, that, as horrible as it is almost understandable. They did it one day. They went to bed that night. They woke up the next morning, thought it was still a good idea, did it again for a year and a half. All right. And by the time it was done, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, that have been killed across France. Anybody and everybody who disagreed was eventually put on here. And when you realize just how insane this becomes, and again, I think the picture on the right really shows it. I mean, the people were just bloodthirsty for revenge. It's hard to remember that this was happening in France, one of the most civilized societies in the world then as well as now, right? And this was not that long ago. We're talking 200 years ago, you know. So this French Revolution with the Reign of Terror happens. 18 months of absolute horror and terror happening in this, you know, in one of the greatest countries in the world, only to end when a young general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte takes over. But more to come on him next week. This concludes our conversation about the revolutions in America and France.